The words were barely a whisper, yet they silenced the room like a gunshot. "Please, help me." Every head in the Crossroads diner turned. The clatter of cutlery stopped. The low hum of the coffee machine suddenly seemed deafening. All eyes fell on the small, trembling woman standing before the table in the corner, and the mountain of a man she was speaking to. He was leather and steel, ink and scars. He was everything a person was supposed to fear. He was steel, and the woman, Mia, had just chosen her monster. The morning had started like any other, which was to say, quietly and with a hint of desperation. The Crossroads Diner was a relic, a time capsule of chrome and cracked red vinyl sitting on a stretch of highway that the world had mostly forgotten. It smelled of stale coffee, frying bacon, and the polish Mia used on the counters every dawn, a ritual inherited from her father. The diner was all she had left of him. It was her home, her burden, and her legacy. She moved through the familiar motions, pouring coffee for the two regulars who still bothered to stop, wiping down a counter that was already clean. Her reflection in the polished chrome of the napkin dispenser looked back at her, tired and pale. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, not from a lack of sleep, but from a surplus of fear. A fear that had a name. The bell above the door chimed, a cheerful sound that made her stomach clench. But it was not the sleek, black sedan she dreaded. It was something else entirely, something louder. A low, guttural rumble grew outside, a sound that vibrated through the floorboards and rattled the sugar shakers on the tables. It was the sound of thunder on a clear day. Mia looked out the window to see a line of motorcycles pulling into the gravel lot. They were big, loud, and unapologetically menacing. At the head of the pack was a machine that looked like it was carved from a block of night, and astride it sat a man who seemed just as formidable. The Iron Disciples had arrived. Her two regulars, old farmers who had been discussing crop prices, froze with their coffee cups halfway to their lips. They exchanged a wide-eyed look, threw a few crumpled bills onto their table, and scurried out the back door as if the devil himself had just pulled up for breakfast. Mia's heart sank. That was the last of her morning business, gone. One by one, they filed in. They were a legion of leather and denim, of scarred knuckles and grim faces. They moved with a purpose that was unsettling, their heavy boots loud on the linoleum floor. They didn't speak, just surveyed the room with hard eyes, taking in every detail. Mia felt impossibly small behind the counter, her hands gripping a damp rag. The man who had led them, the one from the lead bike, entered last. He was older than the others, with streaks of silver in his close-cropped hair and a beard to match. His face was a roadmap of a hard life, with lines etched around his eyes that weren't from smiling. A long, faded scar ran from his temple down his cheek, disappearing into his beard. He wore a leather vest, or a cut, patched with the club's insignia, a grim, iron-jawed skull clenching a wrench. Above it, in stark white letters, were the words Iron Disciples. Below it, the name Steel. He didn't look at her, not at first. His gaze swept the empty diner, noting the hasty departure of the previous customers. He seemed to understand, and a flicker of something, disappointment maybe, or just resignation, passed over his features. Then his eyes, a surprisingly clear and steady gray, finally met hers. Mia expected a sneer, a demand, a threat. She got none of it. He simply gave her a slow, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging her presence in her own establishment. He walked to the corner booth, the one with the best view of the door and the road, and slid onto the vinyl seat. The leather of his vest creaked in the silence. The rest of his club settled at the tables around him, creating a silent, formidable perimeter. A tall woman with a long, dark braid and eyes that missed nothing, her patch-red vixen, took a seat near the door. A hulking giant of a man, so broad he seemed to take up the entire booth by himself, sat opposite Steele. His name was Bear, and it was an understatement. Another, leaner man with the calm, steady hands of a surgeon and a patch that said Doc, sat by the window. A quiet, watchful man who seemed to blend into the shadows, Ghost, took a stool at the far end of the counter. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Mia swallowed hard, her throat dry. She was the owner. She had to serve them. She grabbed a handful of menus, her hands trembling so badly she nearly dropped them. She walked over to the corner booth, her shoes feeling loud and clumsy on the floor. "Welcome to the crossroads," she managed, her voice a thin, reedy thing. Steele looked up from the table, his gray eyes assessing her. He saw the tremor in her hands, the fear in her eyes that was deeper than just a reaction to his club's arrival. He saw the faint, yellowing bruise on her wrist, peeking out from the cuff of her sleeve. He had seen that kind of fear before, in too many places, on too many faces. It was the look of a cornered animal. He didn't take a menu. Coffee, black, and a slice of whatever pie is fresh. His voice was low and gravelly, like stones tumbling in a riverbed. It wasn't unkind. The others gave their orders in grunts and nods. Coffee, water, whatever was on the grill. They weren't picky, they were just there. Mia scribbled on her notepad, trying to keep her handwriting steady, and retreated to the safety of her counter. She brewed a fresh pot of coffee, her hands moving on autopilot. As she worked, she could feel their eyes on her, not in a predatory way, but in a watchful, assessing manner. It was almost more unnerving. She brought them their coffee, her hands shaking as she placed the heavy ceramic mugs on the table. Her fingers brushed against Steele's hand as she set down his cup. His skin was rough, calloused, but there was a surprising warmth to it. He didn't react, just watched. "Thank you," he said, the words quiet but clear. It was the politeness that threw her. She had been braced for gruffness, for demands. The simple courtesy was a crack in the intimidating facade, a glimpse of something else beneath the leather and the hardened exterior. She nodded, unable to speak, and went back to the kitchen to cut the apple pie she had baked just before sunrise. As she sliced into the pie, her mind raced. Who were these men? The Iron Disciples had a reputation, whispered in towns up and down the highway. They were trouble. They were dangerous. But sitting in her diner, they were just quiet men drinking coffee. It didn't make sense. Then she saw it, the sleek, black sedan. It cruised slowly past the diner, the tinted windows hiding whoever was inside. But Mia knew. Her breath hitched in her chest, and the knife slipped in her hand, nicking her finger. A drop of red blood welled up, a stark contrast to her pale skin. She stared out the small kitchen window, watching as the car disappeared down the highway. It was a warning. He was coming. From his booth, Steele saw the whole thing. He saw the black car. He saw Mia flinch as if struck. He saw her grip the knife until her knuckles were white. And he saw the way her shoulders slumped in defeat when the car was gone. He took a slow sip of his coffee. It was good coffee, strong and honest, just like the diner itself seemed to be. He looked around at the clean tables, the faded but cared-for decor, the little touches that made it a place of pride, not just a business. He exchanged a look with Ghost, who gave a subtle, almost invisible nod. Ghost understood. They all did. They had seen this story play out before in 100 different towns. A wolf circling a lone sheep. The pie was excellent. The crust was flaky, the apples perfectly spiced. Steele ate it slowly, savoring it. He and his men were just passing through, on their way to a run in the next state. They could have been on the road an hour ago. But Steele made a decision. They were staying. They would have another cup of coffee. An hour passed. The bikers sat in comfortable silence, a band of stone gargoyles watching over the empty diner. Mia tried to busy herself, wiping down the same counters again and again, refilling salt shakers that were already full. Every time a car passed on the highway, her body tensed. Then the bell on the door chimed again. This time, the sound was a death knell. He walked in as if he owned the place, which, in his mind, he already did. Mr. Gentry was a man who wore his respectability like a tailored suit. His shoes were polished, his hair was perfectly styled, and his smile was a predatory slash of white teeth. He was the kind of man who could ruin you with a handshake and a friendly word. Behind him were two large men in ill-fitting suits, their necks thick and their eyes dull. They were the muscle, the blunt instruments for Gentry's precision cruelty. Gentry's smile faltered for a fraction of a second as he took in the occupants of the diner. He had not expected a welcoming committee of leather-clad outlaws. His eyes, cold and reptilian, swept over the Iron Disciples, dismissing them as irrelevant thugs, common criminals beneath his notice. He focused his attention back on Mia, his smile returning, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. "Mia, my dear," he said, his voice smooth as silk and just as suffocating. "I was just passing by, thought I'd check in, see if you'd reconsidered my generous offer." Mia's face had gone ashen. She stood frozen behind the counter, the dish rag a mangled knot in her hand. "I told you, Mr. Gentry, the diner's not for sale." "Not for sale?" Gentry chuckled, a condescending sound. He walked over to a table, running a finger along its surface and then inspecting it for dust. "Everything is for sale, my dear. It's just a matter of price, and sometimes the price of saying no is much, much higher than the price of saying yes. You understand business, don't you?" From his corner booth, Steele watched, his face impassive. He took another slow sip of coffee. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just observed. He was waiting for the wolf to show its teeth. "This was my father's place," Mia said, her voice shaking but defiant. "I'm not selling." Gentry's smile vanished. His face hardened into a mask of cold fury. "Your father was a foolish old man who didn't know how to run a business. He left you with debt and a failing restaurant. I am offering you a way out, a clean break. You should be grateful." He took a step closer to the counter. "Or perhaps you need a more persuasive argument." One of Gentry's thugs moved. With a lazy, contemptuous flick of his wrist, he swept a stack of clean plates from a nearby table. They crashed to the floor, shattering into 100 pieces. The sound was violent, explosive in the tense silence. Mia flinched, a small cry escaping her lips. And that was it. That was the moment. The teeth were shown. Steele set his coffee mug down on the table. He didn't slam it. He placed it gently, but the small, deliberate click echoed through the diner like a judge's gavel. Every biker in the room tensed, their quiet stillness transforming into a coiled, predatory readiness. Gentry barely glanced at them. "Clean that up," he snapped at Mia, "and then we'll finish our conversation." But Mia didn't move. Her eyes were wide with terror and desperation. She looked at Gentry, the man in the suit who promised ruin. She looked at his thugs, the physical manifestation of his threats. She looked at the shattered pieces of her father's plates, a symbol of her shattered life. She was alone. She was trapped. And then her eyes drifted to the corner booth, to the man with the scarred face and the quiet, gray eyes. He was a monster, according to the world, a danger, an outlaw. But the man in the suit, the respectable man, he was the one destroying her. In that moment of absolute clarity, born of pure desperation, she knew. Sometimes, the only thing that can fight a monster is another monster. She took a shaky breath. She walked out from behind the counter, her steps uncertain on the linoleum floor littered with broken ceramic. She didn't look at Gentry. She walked straight to Steele's table. He watched her approach, his expression unreadable. She stopped in front of him, the hulking form of Bear to her right, the silent intensity of Steele before her. She was trembling from head to toe, but she held his gaze. She had to make the choice. The words were barely a whisper, yet they silenced the room like a gunshot. "Please, help me." The entire diner went utterly still. Gentry's sneer froze on his face. His thugs stopped their posturing. It was a tableau of confrontation, the predator, the prey, and the unforeseen protectors. Steele did not look away from her. He saw the raw courage it took for her to walk across that room, to ask for help from the very men the world had taught her to fear. He saw the last flicker of hope in her eyes, a hope she had placed entirely in his hands. Slowly, deliberately, he pushed his chair back. The scrape of its legs on the floor was the only sound. He stood up, and he seemed to fill the entire room. He was not as tall as Bear, but he possessed an aura of absolute authority that dwarfed everyone, including the arrogant Mr. Gentry. He looked down at Mia, and his hard face softened for a fraction of a second. He gave a single decisive nod, a promise made, a contract sealed. Then he turned his gaze to Gentry. The warmth vanished, replaced by glacial cold. "The lady." Steele's voice was a low growl, devoid of any emotion but finality. "Doesn't want you here." Gentry stared, momentarily stunned by the sheer audacity. Then he burst into a harsh, barking laugh. You? You're her champion? A pack of greasy, washed-up bikers? Do you have any idea who I am? I know what you are, Steele replied, his voice still level. You're a bully, and you're in our way. Your way? Gentry scoffed, gesturing around the diner. This is my town, my business, and this little girl is going to learn a valuable lesson about respect. He snapped his fingers at his thugs. Get this trash out of my sight. The two men moved forward, confident in their size and their boss's perceived power. They were used to intimidating shopkeepers and scaring old men. They saw a handful of aging bikers. They didn't see the truth. Bear rose from his seat. It was like watching a mountain come to life. He didn't say a word. He simply took one step forward, planting himself between the thugs and Mia. He crossed his massive arms over his chest, his biceps straining the seams of his leather vest. He was an immovable wall of muscle and loyalty. The thugs hesitated. They had a foot of height and 100 pounds of muscle on most people. On Bear, they were just average. Vixen stood up too, moving to Mia's side. She placed a reassuring hand on the young woman's shoulder, a silent gesture of solidarity. Her other hand rested near the hilt of a large knife sheathed on her belt. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, were locked on Gentry, missing nothing. Doc and Ghost rose in unison, flanking Steele. They formed a phalanx, a solid line of leather and resolve. The 5 of them against Gentry's 3. The odds had shifted, but Gentry was too arrogant to see it. I'm giving you one chance to walk out that door, Gentry sneered, his confidence buoyed by a belief that money and influence always won. Or my friends here are going to introduce your faces to the pavement. Steele didn't even look at the thugs. His eyes remained locked on Gentry. Bad choice, he said softly. Very bad choice. While Gentry had been posturing, Ghost had been busy. His phone had been in his hand, his thumb moving deftly across the screen. He wasn't texting, he was working. Ghost was the club's intel man. Before he had found Brotherhood with the Disciples, he had spent a decade in Army signals intelligence. He knew how to find people. He knew how to dig up the secrets they thought were buried forever. He caught Steele's eye and gave a subtle dip of his chin. It was done. Steele allowed a small, cold smile to touch his lips. It was a terrifying sight. You talk a lot about who you are, Mr. Gentry. Let's talk about that. Your name is Marcus Gentry, isn't it? Gentry's sneer faltered. What of it? You used to work in the city, Steele continued, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of a prosecutor listing charges. Big shot investment banker. Had a nice office, fancy clients, until you got a little too creative with their accounts. Disbarred, facing indictment, so you vanished. Gentry's face paled. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving behind a pasty, sickly gray. I don't know what you're talking about. Oh, I think you do, Steele pressed on, taking a slow step forward. The bikers moved with him, a single, cohesive unit. You came here, to this small town, where nobody knew your name. You started a consulting business, offered protection, just a polite word for extortion. You find struggling businesses, people like this young lady, and you squeeze them. You bleed them dry, and when they have nothing left, you take what remains for pennies on the dollar. Ghost held up his phone, the screen glowing. On it was a mugshot of a younger, smugger Marcus Gentry. Below it, a list of articles detailing a massive fraud investigation. The mask was not just slipping, it had been ripped away. Gentry's facade of respectable businessman crumbled, revealing the desperate, cowardly con man underneath. His eyes darted towards the door, then to his thugs, seeking reassurance. He found none. His hired muscle looked unnerved, realizing they had hitched their wagon to a man who was not a powerful kingpin, but a wanted criminal. This is ridiculous, Gentry stammered, his voice losing its silky smoothness, becoming shrill and panicked. You can't prove anything. I own the sheriff in this county. Maybe you do, Steele said calmly, but you don't own the state police, and they're very interested in the whereabouts of a one Marcus Gentry, wanted for questioning in a multi-million-dollar fraud case. They're also interested to hear about your new business venture here. Ghost sent them a very detailed email with a map. In the distance, a faint, high-pitched sound began to cut through the quiet of the afternoon. A siren. It was far away, but it was getting closer. Panic seized Gentry. Pure animal panic. His eyes were wide, cornered. He shoved one of his own men aside. "Get out of my way!" he shrieked, making a desperate bolt for the door. He never made it. Bear's arm shot out, his hand clamping down on Gentry's shoulder like a steel trap. He lifted the squirming, shouting man off his feet with one arm, as if he weighed nothing. Gentry's expensive shoes dangled a foot above the floor. "You're not going anywhere," Bear rumbled, his voice a low earthquake. The two thugs, seeing their boss so easily neutralized and hearing the approaching sirens, made a smarter calculation. They looked at each other, then at the wall of impassive bikers, and they raised their hands in surrender. They were hired muscle, not loyal soldiers. Their fight was over. The sirens grew louder, resolving into the familiar whoop-whoop of approaching patrol cars. Two state trooper vehicles screeched to a halt in the gravel lot, their lights painting the diner in strobing flashes of red and blue. Uniformed officers stormed in, weapons drawn, expecting a volatile situation. What they found was an oddly calm scene. Two men standing with their hands up, a third well-dressed man held effortlessly in the grip of a giant biker, and a group of leather-clad men and women standing guard over a pale but resolute young woman. Steele stepped forward to meet the lead trooper. "He's all yours, officer. His name is Marcus Gentry. You've been looking for him." He handed over Ghost's phone. "And this should help you with your local investigation." The troopers were professional and efficient. They cuffed a sputtering, threatening Gentry, who was now screaming about lawyers and lawsuits. They cuffed his two bewildered thugs. As they led him away, Gentry shot a look of pure venom at Mia. "This isn't over. You'll regret this." Steele stepped into his line of sight, blocking Mia from his view. "Yes, it is," he said, his voice a quiet promise of retribution if Gentry ever came near her again. Gentry flinched and was shoved into the back of a patrol car. The cars pulled away, their sirens fading into the distance, leaving behind a profound silence in the diner. It was over. The immediate threat was gone, but the aftermath remained. The shattered plates on the floor, the lingering tension in the air, and Mia, who stood trembling, leaning against the counter for support, tears finally streaming down her face. They were tears of relief, of fear, of overwhelming gratitude. The crisis had passed, but the real work was just beginning. Vixen was the first to move. She wrapped a comforting arm around Mia's shaking shoulders, her touch firm and steady. "It's okay now," she said, her voice surprisingly gentle. "You're safe." She guided Mia to a chair, sitting with her, speaking in low, soothing tones. Doc went behind the counter, emerging with a first aid kit. He gently took Mia's hand, inspecting the small cut from the knife. "Let's get this cleaned up," he said, his manner calm and professional. He worked with an efficiency that spoke of years of practice, patching up wounds far worse than this, in places far more dangerous. While they tended to Mia, Steele, Bear, and Ghost started to clean. Bear found a broom and dustpan, his huge hands surprisingly deft as he swept up the shattered ceramic. Ghost began righting the overturned tables and chairs, his movements economical and precise. Steele picked up the menus and napkins, methodically resetting the tables that Gentry's thug had disturbed. They didn't speak of what had just happened. They didn't need to. They moved as a team, a well-oiled machine shifting from protectors to restorers. They were fixing what had been broken, not just the physical mess, but the violation of Mia's sanctuary. Mia watched them through her tears, overwhelmed. These terrifying men, these outlaws she had been so afraid of, were quietly and methodically putting her world back together. They had faced down her tormentor, exposed him, and handed him to the law. And now they were sweeping her floor. "Why?" she finally whispered, her voice hoarse. She looked from Vixen's kind face to Steele, who was now wiping down the counter Gentry had touched, erasing the man's presence from her diner. "Why did you help me?" Steele stopped his work and turned to face her. He walked over, his boots making a soft sound on the clean floor. He leaned against the counter, his expression serious. "A long time ago," he began, his voice low, "I had a sister. She was smart, funny, full of life. She got involved with a man who looked good on the outside. Clean suit, nice car, big smile, just like him. He jerked his head in the direction the police cars had gone. He seemed perfect, but behind closed doors, he was a monster. He broke her down, piece by piece, took her money, her confidence, her spirit. He paused, his gray eyes distant, lost in a painful memory. We didn't know how bad it was. She was too scared, too ashamed to tell us. By the time we found out, it was too late to save her. We lost her. The diner was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator. The other bikers had stopped their work, listening to their leader's rare moment of vulnerability. After that, Steele continued, his voice hardening with resolve, I made a promise, we all did, that we would never stand by and watch a bully prey on someone who couldn't fight back. That we would be the ones to step in when no one else would. We don't care what the world thinks of us. We have our own code. And that code says we protect our own. We protect the vulnerable. We don't let the wolves win. He looked directly at Mia, his gaze intense and unwavering. When you walked over to my table, you weren't just asking a stranger for help. You were asking for sanctuary. You put your faith in us. And the Iron Disciples do not betray that faith. Ever. Mia stared at him, tears welling in her eyes again, but for a different reason. She understood now. Their intimidating exterior was armor. It was a wall they had built around a core of fierce, unwavering honor. They weren't the monsters. They were the guardians who looked like monsters. Thank you, she said, the words full of a gratitude so immense it felt inadequate. I don't know how I can ever repay you. Bear, having finished sweeping, set the dustpan down with a soft thud. He looked at Mia, and for the first time, a genuine warm smile broke across his rugged face. You can repay us with another slice of that apple pie, he rumbled. And maybe keep the coffee coming. The tension in the room finally broke. Mia let out a watery laugh, a sound of pure relief. Vixen squeezed her shoulder. Doc gave her a reassuring nod. Coffee and pie for life, Mia declared, her voice stronger now. For all of you, it's on the house, always. She stood up, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She felt a new strength coursing through her. The fear was gone, replaced by a profound sense of safety. She walked back behind her counter, but this time, it didn't feel like a cage. It felt like her command post. She poured fresh coffee for her protectors. She cut 5 generous slices of apple pie. As she served them, she noticed something. The diner didn't feel empty anymore. It felt full. It felt protected. It felt like home again. The Iron Disciples didn't leave that day. They stayed for the rest of the afternoon, a silent, leather-clad guarantee against any further trouble. As word of what happened spread through the small town's gossip mill, people started to drive by, slowing down to stare. They saw the motorcycles parked in a neat row, and through the window, they saw the bikers sitting and drinking coffee, just like any other customers. They had become more than patrons. They had become family. That day marked a turning point for the Crossroads Diner, and for Mia. The Iron Disciples made the diner a regular stop on their routes. They never let her charge them, instead leaving a crumpled pile of bills on the table that was always far more than what they owed. They became her unofficial security, her big brothers, her confidants. Bear took it upon himself to fix the wobbly counter stool. Doc restocked her first aid kit with professional-grade supplies. Vixen helped her repaint the faded sign out front, her artistic hand surprisingly steady. Ghost installed a new security system, state-of-the-art, and showed her how to use it. Steele would just sit in his corner booth, drinking black coffee, and watch over her. He rarely said much, but his presence was a constant, comforting reassurance. He was the rock upon which her new life was being built. The town's perception began to change too. The fear and suspicion that had always followed the Iron Disciples slowly gave way to a grudging respect and then to outright admiration. People started coming back to the diner, drawn in by the story, which had already become a local legend. They came to see the bikers, and they stayed for Mia's pie. Business boomed. Mia was no longer the scared, trembling woman Gentry had tried to break. She was confident, happy, and strong. She bantered with Bear, shared quiet conversations with Vixen, and learned from Steele's quiet wisdom. She had found her courage by placing her trust in the most unlikely of saviors. 6 months passed. The diner was unrecognizable. It was vibrant and bustling, always filled with a mix of truckers, locals, and the occasional leather-clad biker. Mia had hired 2 new waitresses to help with the rush. The sign out front now read, "The Iron Crossroads Diner, a tribute to her guardians." Inside, hanging on the wall behind the counter, where everyone could see it, was a framed photograph. It showed Mia, beaming, standing in front of the diner, surrounded by the entire Iron Disciples Club. Steele stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder, a rare, small smile on his face. It was a portrait of a new kind of family, forged in a moment of crisis and bound by honor. One crisp autumn evening, as the sun was setting, Steele sat in his usual booth, nursing a cup of coffee and watching Mia manage the dinner rush with an expert's grace. He felt a deep sense of pride. This was what their code was all about. Not the fights, not the reputation, but this. Making a difference. Leaving a place better than they found it. The bell on the door chimed. A young woman stood hesitantly in the doorway, clutching the hand of a small, solemn-looking boy. She was thin and pale, and a dark, ugly bruise marred her cheekbone. Her eyes darted around the crowded diner, wide with a familiar, hunted fear. She had clearly been crying. The patrons fell silent, their conversations dying down as they took in the scene. Mia stopped what she was doing, her face filled with an immediate, profound empathy. She knew that look. She had worn that look. The woman's desperate eyes scanned the room, searching for something. She had heard the stories. She had heard whispers on the road of a place, a diner that was a sanctuary, a place protected by men who didn't back down. She had driven for 2 days, running on fumes and hope to find it. Her gaze finally landed on the corner booth, on the man with the scarred face and the calm gray eyes. The leader. Steele met her gaze. He saw the bruise, the terror, the silent plea. He saw his sister. He saw Mia. He saw another soul in need of sanctuary. He pushed his chair back, the familiar scrape of its legs on the floor a signal. The other disciples in the diner, Bear and Ghost, who were having dinner at the counter, immediately went still, their attention focused. Steele stood up and walked towards the woman and her child. He didn't loom over them. He stopped a respectful distance away and crouched down, bringing himself to eye level with the little boy. "Welcome to the crossroads," he said, his gravelly voice impossibly soft. "You're safe here." The woman's shoulders sagged with a relief so total it was heartbreaking. Tears streamed down her face as she nodded, unable to speak. The little boy, who had been hiding behind his mother's legs, peeked out at the large, scarred man. He wasn't scared. He saw the kindness in Steele's eyes. Mia was already there, a glass of water in one hand and a warm smile on her face. "Come on in," she said to the woman, her voice full of a strength and compassion she hadn't possessed 6 months ago. "Let's get you a warm meal. You're with family now." Steele stood, watching as Mia led the woman and her son to a quiet booth. He knew what would happen next. The club would mobilize. They would find them a place to stay. They would provide protection. They would handle whatever monster was hunting them. They would do what they always did. He returned to his booth and picked up his coffee cup. He looked at the picture on the wall, at Mia's smiling face. He had come to this diner looking for nothing more than a piece of pie. He had found something more. He had found a reminder that their code wasn't just a set of rules. It was a living, breathing thing. And here, at the Iron Crossroads, it had found a home. The work was never done. The road was long. But for a moment, all was right in their world. Justice had been served, and the circle of protection grew ever wider.